looking at some of the trends and risks and threats for water systems, and then looking at some ways to grapple with what it means to do resiliency planning. There's no silver bullet. There's a lot of different ways that communities can approach this based on what they need to do for their own resiliency and what they've done for planning in the past. And then we'll offer some ideas for implementing resilience strategies, and then I'll share a few resources and tools with you near the end. So truth in advertising, I have reworked this presentation for the hour webinar time frame today. So if it seems like I'm not quite sure what the next slide is, it's probably right. So today for the purpose of today's webinar, I'd like to define resiliency as a community. A resilient community is one in which residents and institutions have the capacity to prepare for, respond to, and recover from events and trends with minimal outside assistance. And so really that means being able to plan for and adapt to any changes that may take place in your community with the tools and the resources available to that community. There's a lot of things to consider when you talk about resiliency. So often, and even today with this webinar, we'll be maybe more water focused because of the purpose of this program, focusing on drinking water utilities and small systems. But resiliency means so much more than disaster or flood recovery or drought. And so there's a lot of ways that there's a lot of things that community resilience can and probably should include. So when you're assessing your resiliency, consider your own municipal financial health. How is your dashboard, so to speak, the ratio between revenues versus expenses, or looking at different parts of the community as far as the utility and different departments of the municipality. And then what's the community's financial health? And so looking at the people that municipality serves. So looking at the business community, the economic viability of your main street, if you have a main street. What are the major industries, the major sectors in your community? Are you an agricultural community? Is it growing? Is it stable? Because the financial health of the community that you serve is a prime indicator of the financial health of the municipality. If your ratepayers are struggling, it's going to be hard for you to also make sure that your revenues cover your costs. And so you also want to consider your community demographics. So are you an aging community, a community that's growing, that's stable, a community that maybe shrinking, and what does that mean for your rate base, for your revenue, for your infrastructure? And then I also think it's important to consider your relation to neighboring communities. Is there a lot of business in an adjacent town or village, but the residents tend to live in your community? And so you'd be invested in the economic viability, the stable infrastructure of that neighboring community, because it is essentially the livelihood of those who live in your community. And then, of course, there's the environmental resiliency. Your water supply, is it threatened or protected in both quality and quantity? What about potential impacts from storms, drought, fire? And then looking at other social, cultural, and economic changes. How is industry shifting in your community or not? Are you what we like to think of here in the Northeast, an eds and meds community? Many small communities that thrive on colleges, universities, and hospitals that as economic engines for not just their town or city, but the region. And whether you believe in climate change or not, I think adaptation to change is important. Whether you want to think about adaptation to climate change or just change in general, every community is changing and will change. When we work with communities on a one-to-one basis, I really ask people to plan for the people that they expect to live there in 30 years. And most of the people that I work with are likely to be either not there in 30 years or on their way out in 30 years. And it really gets people to think about, what do I want this community to be for the next generation? And how do we plan for that? All right, so lots to consider with resiliency. But then there's a few questions that I think is important for communities to ask themselves. Do we even know whether or not we're resilient? And I bet if Houston had asked themselves that, as in this picture from the storms last year, I'm not sure that this would have been part of their what they would have seen themselves, where they would have seen themselves at the time. And then when disaster does happen, and a disaster could be an environmental one, like the picture we see here in Puerto Rico, but again, if a major employer leaves and you're the major user for your water utility, the major ratepayer, the major tax base is gone now, that's a disaster. It's just a disaster of a different kind, an economic disaster. So how, if, and where do you rebuild after these kinds of events? And thinking about resiliency also is trying to get to the point where you're proactive in your planning, proactive in your resiliency planning versus being reactive to any kind of disaster response. Being able to be resilient means being able to think about different scenarios for the future of your community and for your utility. And inherent in that is waiting to be reactive is costly. Reaction can be very expensive, and here are a few examples of expense. We have Flint, Michigan, and their public drinking water system and its major failure, and the expense both in public health, in monetary resources, and in the time that it's going to take to improve the water quality in Flint. Oroville Dam, if you were following that last year, after significant drought and then significant rainfall, the failure of that dam in California, of course Hurricane Katrina to the left in 2005, and the flooding in UCLA. So there's a great cost to deferred maintenance and to deferred planning for extreme weather events or extreme any kind of occurrence that may happen in your community. And these charts basically just show how broad the impact of the loss of water service or the loss of wastewater service is to any community. And so these are broken up by sector. So we have financial services, food and agriculture, government facilities, commercial facilities, and how impacted they would be and how quickly they would be impacted with no water or wastewater service. And so some of the cost to not being proactive, to having some sort of emergency or disaster in your community isn't necessarily borne entirely by the public sector. A lot of those costs are spread out throughout different sectors of your community. And also across different layers of the systems on which we live, right? And so at the bottom here is our ecological system, our waterways, our forests, our beaches, and then on top of that is our infrastructure, our roads, our pipes, our wires. And on top of that is our socioeconomic system, our economic drivers, our business, our schools. And then, of course, the governance system at the top that serves and protects the systems below. And when we think about resiliency, it's so integrated, it's hard to just say, can we make ourselves resilient to flooding? And maybe you can make your utility physically resilient to flooding. But if your community, if the homes and the businesses in your community are also not resilient to flooding, and they no longer are able to continue to live there or need to move or businesses shut down, then you're losing your rate base. And that makes you less resilient as well. So really thinking about all these different systems and how one affects the other. So as I mentioned a minute ago, there's a lot of different ways to think about resiliency. And so I just put this slide in to make sure I'm providing some balance and also thinking about the integrated approach to resiliency planning that most communities should take. If we look too myopically at just making our drinking water plant resilient, we may be missing opportunities to provide further resiliency for the plant, for its operations, for the people who work there and who rely on that drinking water, ultimately to the benefit of the drinking water system. So at the top left, drought is a major concern, particularly in the northeast, or excuse me, the far west. But you'll also notice in the northeast around the Great Lakes, there are some water stressors along the lake shores of some of the Great Lakes, as well as in the southeast, where water is sometimes contested. And then the economic resiliency of industry struggling in the top right. And what does that mean for the utility when business leaves, when people leave? And then in the bottom, thinking about the threats to our public drinking water supplies. The bottom left is a picture of Lake Erie with harmful algal blooms. And so if you've not heard of harmful algal blooms, this is a type of algae that is toxic and toxic to the touch, and also fouls our drinking water supplies. And then, of course, accidents happen, and this is from the East Bay in California, where there was an oil spill that threatened a public drinking water source. So all of these things are depending on where you live and what your community is like, all of these things are considerations for resiliency planning. And I wanted to put this up. This is from the University of California at Berkeley, and they did a study, and I'll show you the metrics that they used on the next slide. They looked at some major metropolitan communities. So this may not apply for a lot of you if you're small drinking water utilities, but major metropolitan centers throughout the country, and they defined, they said who's resilient, and so you can see the folks who are in the blue by their metric are most resilient, and the people who are in the deep red are least resilient. And just anecdotally speaking, you can see the most resilient communities tend to be in the north and tend to be in the northeast, while the ones who are least resilient tend to be in the south and the southwest. And so here are the metrics by which they created this resilience capacity index that they used to populate that map. And so they were looking regionally at economic capacity, and they were looking at such things as income equality, economic diversification, the affordability of the region, quality of life kinds of things, and the business environment. Is this a place where people want to come and do business? The socio-demographic capacity, educational attainment, the rate of disability, the number of people who are out of poverty and who have health insurance. Again, quality of life kinds of things. Because those matter as much as the civic infrastructure and the things to the far right, the metropolitan stability, and the things that are essentially social services, public services that are provided to the folks who ultimately support them through rates and tax space. So again, just one way to look at resiliency. So how can you become resilient? So one way is to suck it up and start planning now for the future and recognize that the sooner that we move forward through a resiliency planning process, as your community moves through a resiliency planning process, the sooner you identify the kinds of implementation measures and strategies that could inform a capital improvement plan for a utility, and you can start to budget for those things. And so as this slide shows, the longer you wait, the higher the cost and the fewer the options. And so thinking now about what would it mean for our community to be resiliency, what are our options, and how can we proceed? And so here are a few ways to so these are planning processes that support resiliency planning. And so before I move forward through this slide, I think we have a poll. So I'd like to ask all of you, looking at comprehensive planning, zoning, asset management planning, and capital improvement planning, which of these do your community either conduct currently, or have you done in the past? And if you don't know or you haven't done any, feel free to do that below. And so we'll close this poll in a few seconds. In 3, 2, 1. So it looks like about a third of folks have done comprehensive planning, a third of communities have zoning and asset management planning. And of course, capital improvement planning tends to be more popular, and here at 48%, because it often goes hand in glove with the budget process every year. For those of you who don't know or have none, I'd encourage you to start thinking about the kinds of planning tools that your community may need to support resiliency planning. And so I'll talk a little more about this slide. So the ESCs really do provide great technical assistance to communities through the planning process. And so I'd like to stop here for a second to let you know that we can help you identify the types of things you might need to do to construct a comprehensive plan. What are the values? What's the value of a comprehensive plan? And then essentially putting that out to the public for their input, their feedback, and essentially their buy-in. Also the value of zoning. My colleague Heather Himmelberger does a great job with asset management planning and then land use planning. And of course, all of these things not only support resiliency, but can inform how you move forward with your resiliency planning. So things like zoning and comprehensive plans and land use planning can be resiliency planning documents if written with that kind of frame or focus. So this table that I have here is essentially a risk assessment matrix. And it is often used in asset management planning. Once you've conducted an inventory, you look at and we can also do this thinking about resiliency. What's the risk of failure? What's the risk of drought or flooding? And so you can look at the probability down the left column and then the severity. So if this pump station failed, how bad would that be? Would it be catastrophic or would it be negligible? And it may be negligible because the pump station only serves one customer, or it may be negligible because you have a replacement that you could put in place quickly. It could be catastrophic because it serves 100 customers and you have no redundancy. And so this is a great place to start as well when you're thinking about not only the risk for your community, but also the assets that you own. And you can do that at any scale. So you could be thinking about your utility, the whole system, or different components of the system and run them essentially through this matrix. So just another way to think about resiliency. Identify the problem. And so again, what are we trying to make ourselves resilient against or for or toward? And it may be sustainable revenue in 20 years. It may be your aging infrastructure. It may be that you are experiencing source water contamination or supply issues or extreme weather events that you need to be better prepared for. So what are your vulnerabilities then? If we're talking about aging infrastructure, deferred maintenance, the rates that your customers pay, and what they need to be in order to begin to reinvest in your infrastructure. What kind of management system do you have for your infrastructure as far as asset inventory and replacement. Investigate your options. And so again, using a different example, if we're talking about source water, are there other drinking water sources around? Are there neighboring communities that you can essentially regionalize with, to work with, to connect to? So what are your other options? Working with the agricultural community on nutrient removal in your source water. And then evaluate the risks to those options and the costs of each option. And that'll really help you to figure out the best path forward. And finally, then you'll take action. So another way to think about resiliency, again, is so there's the 4 R's of resiliency. So redundancy, again, do you have that extra pump available should one fail? Do you have more than one viable source of drinking water? Do you have more than one fire station on this side of town? There was one community we worked with once. They had one bridge over a creek, and that bridge led to their emergency services building and also the hospital in town. And the first time they ever experienced a significant flood, it washed out that bridge, and they realized how vulnerable they were because half of the town couldn't reach the hospital, and the emergency services providers couldn't reach half of the town because the bridge was gone. So redundancy, and then robust. How much support do you have when you need to attack a problem? And what kind of resources do they have? And how quickly can they respond? So you may feel robust because you have neighboring communities that you can rely on, but can they be there quickly? So things to think about. So I want to stop or switch gears a little bit here to, I just realized I missed the poll question. Oh well, anyway, I want to switch gears here a little bit and share a few experiences from some communities that will segue into talking about one of the tools that the EPA has created for us. And so, here's a couple of examples of what's happened recently. In the bottom right, we have Houston, and in the top left, we have the Virgin Islands. And thinking about, where they should go from here from a resiliency planning perspective, considering some of the questions that we raised earlier. So I grew up in Maryland, and when I lived there 20 years ago, Annapolis never flooded. Now it has tidal flooding events 40 times a year. Apparently when water warms up, it also expands. And so they're going through a planning process to look at areas of the city that are vulnerable and that are becoming inundated too often to be viable. The Naval Academy is doing great work and they're near the top of this picture, I think, that's shaded partially in blue. They're doing great work in trying to make themselves resilient because they see that they're in a vulnerable position. This is Venice, Italy. So the inset down in the bottom right, if you decide to buy some tickets to go visit beautiful Venice, plan to either wear boots or walk on scaffolding most of the time because they're becoming inundated again by tidal events. And it's a really cool thing, and I saw it on Nova, on PBS, but they've built this massive wall, which is the larger picture here, and it's essentially filled with air. And it will rise up, and you see it here kind of partially risen up out of the water to stand at a 90-degree angle against the water to protect Venice from high tide. And you can see the massive scale of this wall based on the size of the boats that are nearby. So these are resiliency measures that communities obviously around the world are taking to protect themselves. And in Binghamton, New York, if anyone knows where that is, I lived there for 10 years. They experienced two significant storms, one in 2006, one in 2011. And this is one of 3 hospitals in Binghamton. And it's unfortunately built, about half of it is in the floodplain of the Susquehanna River. And after 2006, the entire hospital was shut down. Major community vulnerability for Binghamton when a third of your your hospital services are essentially gone. And for Lourdes Hospital, a private hospital, dealing with all of those patients that were stuck on those upper floors and without probably access to some of the care that they needed, they decided to act quickly and they built a flood wall around their campus. And then in 2011, another significant flood happened, and this is the picture of Lourdes Hospital fully operating while essentially holding back the floodwaters that only 6 years previously had inundated it. And so while we're hanging out in Binghamton, I'll share with you a case study of the Binghamton-Johnson City Joint Sewage Treatment Facility. Those same floods obviously affected this sewage treatment plant. And what happened in one of those floods was that one of their treatment tank walls was clearly significantly compromised. All of the treatment media was washed away. And actually the treatment media is not inexpensive for those of you who deal in that. And so not only did they have this kind of catastrophic collapse and their treatment media washed away, but they were unable to treat sewage for quite some time. And so there was quite a bit of raw sewage in the Susquehanna River until they could make their repairs. They're making their repairs here, and they realized how vulnerable they were. They realized that they weren't resilient, and they realized the effect, the impact on their community, on the economic viability of their community. Binghamton-Johnson City area is only about 150,000 people, which may sound large to some of you, but to support such significant infrastructure improvements did mean significant community investment. And also the environmental impact of having a sewage treatment plant fail in a relatively vulnerable water body, because the Susquehanna River feeds the Chesapeake Bay, and of course nutrients are a big deal there. So they decided to work with the EPA on the EPA's Climate Resilience Evaluation and Awareness Tool, which the acronym is CREATE. So it's a risk assessment tool, looking at risk, talking about some of the things, some of the questions I've posed to you already, focused on utilities, to adapt to extreme weather events, and to better understand where they're going and plan for future conditions. So this is a free tool. There's a lot of information online. There's some really great videos that you see down here at the bottom of the slide. There's a YouTube video there. I can't necessarily play it very well through the webinar, but I encourage you, when we post this webinar online, to go back and click that link and better understand the value of CREATE. It's a free tool that any utility can use. And so what they did in part was look at, so BJCJ-STP is the Binghamton-Johnson City treatment plant. So part of the CREATE tool has you look at your existing measures. So what did they do when they had high flow events? They put up sandbags. They looked at models, weather forecast monitoring, looked at the system performance models, and they had an emergency response plan for flood events. Clearly that wasn't enough. And so at the end of the process, this is a very busy slide and it's small font, but the point of including this is that part of the output, if you will, of CREATE was to create this list of adaptive measures that would improve the resiliency of that plant. So the first one, backup generators, and then the description, 3 backup generators and diesel storage tanks, blah, 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 and then an estimated cost. And just a slight plug for the EFCs. This is where we would come in and help you identify ways to pay for that cost, either through state or federal funding programs or through existing local sources. So I think this is a really cool tool that the EPA has developed, and it's one of many, many resiliency tools. And again, it's something we can help you identify which tool is right for you based on your utility, your community, and your issues, your resiliency concerns. So other things for communities and utilities to think about, risks to consider, the flooding, the backup, a street collapse, odors, beach closures, negative economic impact, I&I, changing regulations, and structural concerns, not dissimilar from the one that we just saw in Binghamton. But focusing on the plant alone is not enough. You need to be looking at your distribution system. That's part of the asset management process, is inventorying your system, looking at your manholes, what condition are they in, looking at your hydrants, your pipes, your valves, conveyances for wastewater. What physical barriers are there? Your water collection, pretreatment, and treatment facilities, chemical use and storage, storage and distribution facilities, and then any electronic, computer, or automated systems you may have that help you manage your system. So now I want to talk a little bit about some of the planning frameworks that are out there. CREATE is certainly one that gives you some very specific utility-based things to implement, but there are other ways to think about planning for resiliency. So this is developed by NOAA, and this is a hyperlink to the NOAA site. So you could go through there, and for some reason I'm having trouble doing it now on my machine, and it's probably because I want to. But if you would click through that link, then you will find the NOAA website that has the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. And this is focused on small water utility systems, small water utilities. And so I think this is, CREATE is one great tool, but this is one other tool that I'm aware of that goes directly to, or is designed directly for small drinking water systems. So Savannah is actually sending out through the chat box now the link to this page if you want to check it out while I continue on. Otherwise, again, it's a hyperlink that you can peruse when we post this webinar on our website later. So lots of good stuff there for you to take a look at. There's one other planning process that I wanted to briefly share with you, and it's called the Safe and Sure approach. This is probably about the 13th Venn diagram you've seen in this presentation so far. But this was developed by some folks just last year, and I think it's worth at least thinking about and considering. I also think that some of these subsequent slides are great prompts for you to think about what are the threats for your community, what are the impacts of different considerations for resiliency. And so essentially it's so the Venn diagram, we have threats, your system, the impact of those threats on your system, and the consequences. So we'll start with the threats. So to the left we have internal threats, and so those are things like insufficient rehabilitation, resource depletion, lack of investment, deferred maintenance, accident. And then we have external things you can't necessarily control, but you should plan for. Extreme weather, power outage, stringent regulation, increasing affluence, urban creep or urban sprawl. And then chronic and acute. So chronic are things that happen slowly, like climate change and urban creep. Acute are things that happen kind of at a snap of a finger. They're very distinct in time and even space. And so I think again, this is a good draft for you to think about, what are the resiliency concerns for your community? Maybe not all of these bullet points are relevant to you, and so delete them off and add the ones that are. But I bet some of them would be helpful for you as you go through the resiliency planning process. So the threat, and then the system impacts. And so we have internal and external, and then we have functional, so operations, maintenance, and then structural, the physical infrastructure itself. And so you can see some examples there. Pipe failure, pump failure, power, increased demand, changing composition, contamination, etc. And then what are the consequences? And so we have, again, direct and indirect. So the things that directly affect the utility or the community, depending on what scale you're planning for. And then tangible and intangible. And so intangible things are things you can't necessarily physically touch or see, but they can be measured and they do have an impact. Loss of ecosystem services, damage to cultural heritage, societal disruption, psychological damage. Just knowing that you're without water or power or that a major event is coming or has come creates psychological damage and societal disruption. Things that you can't touch, but you know they're there. All right, and so you've created those four quadrants, so to speak, and you've populated them with the things that make sense for your community, for your utility, and then you go back and try to create actions based on some of those. And so if we look at, again, and there's different types of actions. We're learning from this experience, or we're mitigating the damage from this threat to our system, or we're adapting or coping. And so looking at the example of mitigation, looking at the threat of insufficient rehabilitation, essentially not being able to invest quickly enough or quickly enough in our infrastructure. So the action is to accelerate the asset replacement strategy, and that may seem like a no-brainer, but the process to get to that action could be intense for some communities. It may mean a rate increase. It may mean a lot of negotiation with the town board. It may mean hiring an outside consultant to create an asset management plan for you in order to be both efficient and effective in which assets you replace, in which order, at what time. Accidents, develop a safety culture. Urban creep, enforce planning controls. This is where comprehensive planning, land use planning, and zoning all come in and can help support, again, your resiliency goals. Adaptation. You see, again, some examples here of the threats that were identified and actions that the community or the utility can take. And then, so coping. This is when something has happened. You've had a major flood event. Now's not the time to do an asset management plan. Now's the time to cope with where you find yourself in time and space without drinking water, without a place to live or do business. And so property damage, temporarily relocate, spread of disease, boil water, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is a great tool for communities to consider. It's a great tool for you to be thinking about, even if it's at the very beginning stages of considering how can we be resilient and what is it that we don't know about our own community. And we'd rather find that out now around this table with this matrix than waiting for that disaster, economic or environmental or otherwise, to come and point out to us what and how we're not resilient. And so a few other ideas for implementing resiliency strategies, again, coming out of that matrix system, looking at flooding impacts and considering regional interconnections. The redundancy is so powerful. I have been witnessing some communities in upstate New York begin to share services, but more than just share services, share water infrastructure. There's 9 towns around Chautauqua Lake in western New York that have created a shared water utility. And it's not its own authority, it's a shared water utility, and they're working together to administer it. It's taken them several years to put it together, but they realized they had to because their water quality was not getting any better, and it was kind of outside of the purview of the communities to do anything about it. Alternative power supplies, solar panels, other kinds of things, but again, having redundancy in the connections. Being able to monitor and inspect infrastructure, that's part of asset management planning. It's part of being able to plan through capital improvement planning on what needs to be replaced or rehabbed and at what time. Elevating or flood-proofing assets. A lot of communities find this out the hard way. And then also joining a mutual aid network like WARN. Maybe seasonal, for changes in seasonal runoff, maybe part of your concern, monitoring that, looking at snowpack and runoff changes, putting those predictions into models, updating drought contingency plans. If you've been following what's been going on in California the last few years, they had several years of drought, followed by several months of significant rain, and it actually did replenish some of their water, but it also caused a lot of damage. The Oroville Dam is one example, but some of the trees were just falling over because they had drank up so much water that they became top heavy. Who would have expected that? Diversifying water supplies, increasing storage capacity, and again the regional interconnections. Looking at runoff, particularly for waterside communities, looking at green infrastructure, naturalized infrastructure, ways to slow down, spread out, or soak up the stormwater through a distributed system, investing in watershed management. If you're a coastal community or a community on a lake shore, you should be invested in what's going on in the watershed above you, upstream, because it has an impact on your community. Modeling and monitoring. And then looking at stressed sewer systems or water systems. Some of these are more focused on the sewer. Green infrastructure, again, keeping the stormwater out of the system. Looking at existing ecosystems and using them to the benefit of your system, diverting stormwater to green space, essentially to use the green space as storage during storm events. New York City is doing this with some of their parks after the hurricane they experienced. Reducing I&I, again, infiltration and inflow. Again, by better managing your assets, doing asset management inventory, but also working with the private sector. A lot of the laterals on private property are part of that infiltration and inflow challenge. And then by doing that, you're increasing the capacity of your system. By removing the I&I and the stormwater, you actually have more space in your system to clean the water that needs to be cleaned and to prepare for the need for that capacity during maybe significant events. And then modeling the stormwater impacts to your service area as well. So, we've been talking a lot about water and utilities, which again is the focus of this program, but thinking about the community and economic impacts as well, and thinking about things that you can do to show your value to your community. We hear an awful lot of discussion about infrastructure at the federal level these days, and rarely hear the word pipe or pump. It's always airports and bridges and roads. Those things we can see. We can't see pipes and pumps all the time. I think sometimes our industry is forgotten by the people who pay for it. And so getting out there, letting them know what you're doing, that you're serving them, that you're trying to use their money wisely to provide a good quality product is part of that. But also, listening to what they need in order to stay viable within your community. So a few other resources for planning, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions should anybody have them. Again, as Savannah showed you earlier, in your control panel, there's a questions tab. If you click the arrow down, it'll open up and you can type in a question there, and Savannah will take any and we'll answer them in just a few minutes. So other resources for planning that I think are good for folks to consider. And again, what kind of resiliency are you looking for? Is it economic? Is it environmental? Are you doing it at the community level or the utility level? And so depending on how you answer those questions, different tools will be more valuable to you than others. But here are some that I think are particularly good for small drinking water systems. So the EPA has created this climate-ready water utilities guide, and so the link is at the bottom. It's a PDF, and it's essentially adaptation strategies for small water utilities, and it just allows you to figure out, again, what are the conditions that you're facing and how best to manage through them. Another couple of guides I think are important. To the left is taking stock of your water system, a simple asset inventory for very small drinking water systems. And so as Savannah pointed out near the beginning of the webinar, there are a number of very small systems on here. So the EPA has created this guide to help you through the asset management process. The EFCs can also help with the asset management, the asset inventory process of that. And we've got a number of webinars on our website about asset management, planning and inventorying. So take a look at those. And then a little more comprehensive guide for a little larger, the small and medium-sized drinking water and wastewater systems, a reference guide of asset management tools. So from a utility perspective, asset management is really the place to start when considering, when moving forward with resiliency planning, because you want to look at the state of your system, what condition is it in, and how critical would any failures be for some of your assets. And then those are some of your vulnerabilities. You've identified those as vulnerabilities and you can move forward, and that alone will make you more resilient. And then you can start looking at some of the bigger system-wide or community-wide resiliency concerns that you may have. And if you're not on one of these resource sharing networks, I think most states, if not all, support a water wastewater agency response network. In Maine, they have ME-WARN, and in New York, we have NIWARN. This is a way to not only share information and resources, but to kind of help each other out and build each other up through problems. And I know in Binghamton, in the southern part of New York, when they had significant floods in 2006 and 2011, the NIWARN network was really invaluable for communities who lost, pumps and other major pieces of infrastructure. And there were communities upstate that were actually driving down with major pieces of equipment to support those utilities getting back up and running again. So I believe that's everything I have to share with you today. I hope that you thought this was valuable. If there are any questions, we'll take them. Again, if you want to type it into the question box, and we can, I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Otherwise, you see my address or my email address and phone number are here. Feel free to reach out to me. Also check out our website. If you would like some technical assistance on this or any other topic that we offer, you can request that directly through a form on the website.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so if attendees have any questions when you submit them, I can ask them to Chris right away. But in the meantime, we can kind of wrap it up with our remaining 2 poll questions. And the first one I have for you is, if you are interested in subscribing to the Environmental Finance Center blog, if you want to sign up for the blog but do not have the opportunity to submit your polling answer today, you can sign up for the blog on the efcnetwork.org website. And we'll leave this poll open for another 5 seconds. Getting ready to close in 3, 2, 1. And lastly, if you are a small water system of 10,000 or fewer people served, are you interested in receiving in-depth technical assistance? And again, if you're interested in in-depth technical assistance but do not have the opportunity to submit your polling answer today, you can review the technical assistance form on our efcnetwork.org website. And you will receive all of these follow-up links in the follow-up email after this webinar. And getting ready to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. And it looks like we have a few questions. Chris, are you ready?
Sure.
All right. An attendee asked, what do you recommend for outside consultants to assist municipalities and to also work with the Environmental Finance Center?
So I take the question to mean I take the question to mean that an outside consultant and an engineering firm or something to both work with municipalities and the Environmental Finance Center. So we often work with, I wouldn't say hand in hand, but very closely with environmental consulting firms who work with communities. Often, but not always, environmental consulting firms aren't able to do some of the financial planning that we do, and so we're added value to whatever project or product that they're providing to the municipality, and sometimes we actually become the conduit for getting, we'll be working with a community on the planning process, and then we may find that at the end of the planning process, they need the product that only an engineering consulting firm can produce, and we'll help them evaluate proposals from different consulting firms to get what they need.
Thank you. And we've received another question. An attendee asked, how can state agencies best assist local water and sewer utilities in resiliency planning?
That's a good question. I'll use New York as an example. Because I'm familiar with it, but also because I think they have a really cool program called the Climate Smart Communities Program. So it's actually a certification program that's through the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. DEP, DEQ, DNR are similar acronyms for other states, comparables to the New York State DEC. And so actually the Environmental Finance Center has worked with communities to move them through the certification process, but also, communities or anybody can do that for themselves. And so when they go through that certification process, it actually opens them up to this whole new field of funding that is really specific to resiliency planning, infrastructure upgrades for resiliency, climate adaptation, extreme weather event resiliency. And so I hold that state program up as an example of something that other states could do to not only promote resiliency to communities within their state, but incentivize them through the funding programs to begin to consider making themselves more resilient.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. So what role does resiliency planning play in conservation?
I'm not sure if we mean water conservation or land conservation, but I think that, and it depends on where we are, where a community is, what their kind of resiliency concern is. If it's drought, water conservation is a resiliency measure, and there's a lot of, like EPA's Water Sense and others, there's a lot of water conservation programs out there that can support that type of conservation that would support resiliency. In a coastal community, in a lakeshore community, maybe with a lot of floodplain, I could see land conservation. In fragile watersheds, I could see land conservation to protect water quality. That would then improve public drinking water systems and protect public health as also something that would support resiliency. And there, depending on which bucket we're in there, there's probably a couple of others, but depending on which bucket we're in there, there's certainly funding programs and technical assistance programs out there to support both water conservation and land conservation to support, again, water quality.
All right, thank you, Chris. So to any of the attendees that have had their questions not answered, we can follow up with you offline via email. In the chat box, I am pushing out a quick survey link. If you could take 5 minutes and let us know how you thought today's session went, it would be really valuable to us. Lastly, I just want to thank Chris for providing his expertise on resiliency planning, and I want to thank all the attendees who have joined us today. Chris, I'll throw it back to you for any additional closing comments.
Thanks, Savannah. Thanks, everybody, for participating and paying attention. This webinar is recorded, so you'll get to hear my lovely voice again and follow along through the PowerPoint presentation once we get it posted on the website. You'll get an email once it's posted, so you can go back and check this out. And again, please reach out to me on resiliency topics or use our technical assistance form if you have any other questions about any of the topics that we do training and technical assistance on. So with that, I thank you all for joining, and have a good day.
Have a good one, everyone. Thank you.